Good evening. I'm Neil Gordon. I'm the CEO here at the Discovery Museum, and welcome to the Discovery Museum Speaker Series. Tonight's webinar is an important conversation, and we have a record number of people sort of joining us for these conversations this year. This is our second time having Dr. Beresin speak with us. Now, we do know that there are a number of people out there who have had power outages, and so we will be recording tonight's session so that people can catch up later. I want to thank all of those of you who have responded to the survey ahead of time. The questions and ideas that you sent us will form the basis for our conversation tonight. But for those of you who have additional questions, please use the Q&A button on Zoom to submit those questions tonight. So before we jump into the speaker series tonight, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the way this series is made possible by our really wonderful sponsors and supporters. After I say a few words about them and the Discovery Museum, we'll jump into our conversation with Dr. Beresin. So first, let me acknowledge our lead sponsors. The Foundation for Metro West was established in 1995 and is the only community foundation serving the region. It promotes philanthropy across the area and helps donors maximize the impact of their local giving. It serves as a resource to all of us local nonprofit organizations, and for all of us, it enhances the quality of life. We appreciate the Foundation's support of this year's speaker series. Enterprise Bank is headquartered in Lowell, Massachusetts, with 24 branch locations throughout the Merrimack Valley and north central regions of Massachusetts and into southern New Hampshire. They're a true community bank, and they lead with a deep sense of mission and purpose. Their success is consistently measured by the success of the individuals, businesses, and communities they enthusiastically support, including their support of the Discovery Museum and our speaker series. Acton Medical Associates is celebrating their 65th birthday this year. They're an independently owned and operated primary care practice for adults and pediatrics in Acton, Harvard, and Littleton, with a fourth location opening this fall. Acton Medical is committed to the good health and wellness of the whole community and sponsors over 130 local causes in addition to their sponsorship of the speaker series. We're very thankful for their support. A couple of quick words about the Discovery Museum. So the Discovery Museum was founded in 1982 with a mission to bring science and nature and play to the families of our area. We served over 250,000 people last year, including reaching 38,000 kids in over 100 communities in their classrooms, in their schools. We're really proud of the fact that we've made our programs very available, accessible, and inclusive to many people by making 25% of them free or nearly free. As we're working with kids and families, there are a couple of important things that we emphasize. We believe in the importance of starting early with kids. We believe that we're here to support parents who are the first teachers of their children. We know that every kid is born naturally creative and curious. It's a tool for them to explore and discover the world around them, and we emphasize supporting that creativity and curiosity. We recognize the outdoors as an enormous tool to support a child's learning and healthy development. And lastly, every child and every family deserves what the Discovery Museum offers, and we make a real effort to try to make ourselves available to everyone. In times like we're having now, play matters more than ever. We've been really proud of the fact that we've been able to reopen our museum and have instituted a number of procedures in response to the pandemic. So we have strict protocols on how people operate indoors and outdoors. We have reduced capacity of the museum at 20%, which is considerably below the allowable open guidelines set by the state. We've received really positive feedback from this. Kids really wanted to get back and out and playing, and they're responding very positively. When we opened the museum back in July, we set a goal of making that first month being completely free. And under our free to play initiative, 1,200 families and over 4,500 people came to the museum in our first month completely for free. This is not the last speaker series of this year, and I would encourage you to connect with us for the next 2 speaker series, which are also available in the program that we sent to you. I should emphasize that this is the 8th year of the Discovery Museum Speaker Series. It is a series that brings expert voices on matters of importance to our whole community, to everyone, free of charge. We hope you'll take the time to join us for either of the 2 remaining events this year, and stay tuned for our series for 2021. For those of you who are out there who are interested in helping the museum, here's just a couple of ways you could do that. You could become a member or buy a membership for somebody else, member of your family. Connect us to your employers who might want to partner with us. Invest in our work. Tell others about what we do. And most importantly, get out there and play yourselves. So, with no further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Jean Barresson to the speaker series. Jean, good evening. This is Jean's second time with us in a 2-part series on the coronavirus and mental health. As a clinician and educator with over 40 years of experience, Dr. Beresin has focused on prevention, early intervention, and treatment of teens and young adults. He's been a keynote speaker at local and international conferences and is often called upon by the media to weigh in on issues relevant to vulnerable populations and the unique impact of societal issues. Dr. Beresin has consulted on a variety of television shows, including ER, Law and Order, SVU, I always get that wrong, and the Emmy Award-winning HBO children's specials, Goodnight Moon, and Other Sleepy Time Tales, Through Children's Eyes, September 11, 2001, and Classical Baby. He was also co-producer of a section of the Parent Resource Center for abcnews.com. In addition to his current role at the Clay Center, Dr. Beresin also directs the Elizabeth Thatcher Akampora Endowment, an outreach program which meets the needs of underserved youth and families in 3 community settings. From 2016 to 18, he served as the senior advisor on mental health and wellness for Students Against Destructive Decisions, or SAD. And he's also won a number of local national teaching awards, including the American Psychiatric Association and National Institute of Mental Health Vestmark Award for Outstanding Teaching. We were really pleased. It's one of the little joys of the pandemic for us was getting to know Jean and finding out that he's an Acton resident since 1983 and lives right around the corner from the museum. Even though we're virtual tonight, Jean, I can almost reach out and wave to you. It's good to see you again.
Great to be here. And I'm a card-carrying member for the plan. In fact, we just expanded it with the new grandchildren, so.
That's terrific. We're looking forward to seeing you around here as we are with all the folks who've been able to join us so far. We are a little bit of a respite for all of the stress and tension that people are under out there, and we'll talk a little bit about all the other things that people can do tonight. I repeat myself in saying that thank you to all the people who filled out the survey, and the questions that I'm going to ask Jean tonight are derived directly from that survey, and we will have time at the end to answer additional questions. But Jean, there are many people who maybe don't know the Clay Center, so maybe we could start tonight by hearing a little bit about what the Clay Center provides and how it helps the families in our communities.
Sure. So the Clay Center for Young Healthy Minds was started in 2013. It's an online platform and it's an educational resource to support the social, emotional, and behavioral growth of young people, as well as families. We have blogs, about 400-ish, covering topics in mental health, mental illness, and also topics that are important to kids and parents. Should we be playing contact sports? The effects of social unrest on children, digital media, body image. So they're topics that are current as well for our blogs. We're in our 4th season of podcasts, and they're on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify. We also have a YouTube channel, MGH Clay Center, where we have a bunch of videos. So it's really a multimedia platform. And our main target audience are parents and teachers, caregivers, all the folks that work with youth. But we found that about 1/3 of our audience are older adolescents and young adults. So we've produced a bunch of material to help them out as well. And certainly welcome people, taking a look at our webpage. It's just mghclaycenter.org. We have tons of resources. And in fact, a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about tonight, we have a coronavirus section, both in English and in Spanish. And we're moving ahead trying to cover as many languages as possible. We also have an outreach program now where we've made our material available to most schools and school districts, in Massachusetts, and we want to extend that.
Yeah, it's just a remarkable set of resources that you all have provided, Jean. It's just really wonderful, and not only is this a great opportunity for people to hear from you tonight, but hopefully it's a reason for people to follow up and check out the resources that are online. So the last time we talked was before school had reopened, and we had talked a little bit about people and their anxiety and stresses, worried about getting ready for back to school, and now everybody is living with it. Kids have started back, whether that's virtually or hybrid model or live in the classroom. All of which are no matter what it is, people are feeling a little stressed out and anxious about it. I think we wanted to start tonight by talking about the question that folks had of they're worried that there's sort of going to be anxiety among their kids, and what are the kinds of things that they should be watching out for or keeping their eyes open for, and as indicators.
Well, all parents and teachers need to know 3 things, and that is what to look for, when to worry, and what to do, the 3 W's. And kids of all ages, I'll go through this developmentally, but kids of all ages want to know, am I safe? Are you, the people taking care of me, safe? How is this going to affect my daily life? And what's the impact of all of this going to be on me? So what parents and teachers and other caregivers need to look for, and I'll do this developmentally. So among preschool kids, you may see some regression. You may see clinginess, troubles with sleeping, tantrums, being a bit more moody, clingy behavior. You may see some regression. And in general, they're going to be responding to largely to parental anxiety and emotions. Among school-age kids, and this is like 1 through 6, 7, the school-age kids are, they're worried. They're worried about bad things happening. They're thinking concretely, the world is seen in good and bad, black and white terms, living and dying. And they're compartmentalizing, they're structuring their world, they're learning how to put things in categories. And naturally, the bad things outweigh the good things, and they're mostly worried about, are the people who are taking care of me going to be okay? You may see some of their symptomatic behavior in moodiness, in lack of attention, in difficulty sleeping, Many school-age kids will have physical complaints such as headaches, shortness of breath, chest pain, stomach aches, which are physical manifestations of anxiety. They'll ask lots of questions, so be prepared to repeat yourself over and over again. It doesn't increase their anxiety. Many school-age kids will work through their anxiety by play, just as the Discovery Museum, wants kids to do. They'll be first responders, they'll be, doctors and healthcare workers, they'll be, they'll be putting out the fires if they're worried about the wildfires in the West. And it doesn't increase their anxiety. Let them do it over and over again, because play is the way they work through some of their anxieties. They will have a bunch of losses. My grandchildren, for example, have a hybrid model. Well, they're pretty much at home, and one of the things they wanted to see is they wanted to see the kids' faces. They asked their parents for a bigger screen. We have to remember that our kids, we can talk about digital, the pros and cons of digital and remote learning, but kids from preschool through teenagers are digital natives. They're used to the screen. We all get Zoom fatigue, but they actually do utilize the screen and can use it more effectively than I think we can. Now, teenagers have a tough time as well. They're more advanced in their thinking. They understand the nuances of the coronavirus and its spread. They understand its implications for the future and the dangers and the risks. They can be irritable, depressed, anxious, withdrawn. You'll see a change in their behavior. They might be more withdrawn. They may be more angry and aggressive. I mean, just as you said, Neil, parents are the kids' first teachers. Parents are also kids' best experts. If something's going wrong with your kid, and teenagers are going to show it. Now, the other thing for teenagers is, remember, their developmental trajectory is really being derailed. Adolescents are in a phase where autonomy, freedom, separation, hanging out, trying out new things apart from the home, separating from home, learning to be independent, learning a sense of identity. All of those normal aspects of adolescence are derailed. So it's a huge time of loss. And it's a huge time of loss for major events. I mean, last spring, graduations, proms, this fall, playing in extracurricular activities. Seniors, for example, who were varsity players, their games are canceled. Musicians aren't able to play. School plays are not happening. So, a lot of their, losses, their academics. I mean, many will find it harder to learn online than in person. Looking for jobs, worrying about getting into college, changes in the way the standardized tests are being given. All of these are major upsets and losses for teenagers. So they are suffering, and they're also suffering from what is called anticipatory grief. They're able to look into the future and worry about what's going to happen next. Am I going to be able to go to college? I'm not going to be able to visit them except virtually. Am I going to get a job? Do I need a gap year? There's a lot of uncertainty about the future, and they're grieving in some ways about what may or may not come to them. So if you see any of those things, then it's really up to us as a community, teachers, family members, siblings, to kind of take note and, again, make the difficult decision about, I'm worried. Is this just a phase? Are they generally okay? Or do I need to do something, more proactive to help them get through this?
That was a really helpful explanation, Gina, and sort of, highlights for parents is sort of they know their kids. They can tell when there are signs that things aren't quite right with them. And those are some really very specific, great examples. So when parents start to see these kinds of signs, what are the things that they can do?
It's a great question. Well, it's the first thing is that we know that parents are anxious too, and anxiety is contagious. And all the research has shown that you can best manage your kids when you control your own anxiety. So it's like when the flight attendant says, if the pressure drops, put the oxygen mask on yourself first, and then help the person next to you. You can't help your kids unless you help yourself. So monitor your own anxiety and do whatever it takes for you to control your anxiety. So some basic examples. Get good information, like about going back to school, about the different models of school, about the COVID pandemic, but not too much. Don't flood yourself, because too much is more than enough. Use social supports. I mean, there's no better way of alleviating anxiety than talking things out to friends, relatives, partners, spouses, community leaders, spiritual leaders. And that could be very, very helpful. Self-care. This is going to be important for both parents as well as kids. And what I mean by self-care, I mean, be aware of diet, of exercise, of getting enough sleep, of using techniques such as yoga, meditation, listening to relaxing music, taking a break and reading, trying not to do everything and spend a little bit of time for yourself. It's very hard to do. I mean, when this began, I, like others, said, this is going to be like a snow day, right? We're all home, we can just take it easy. But it has been, I don't know one person that has felt, one parent that has felt that it is just too much. Not just the isolation, but taking care of the household, working either remotely or as an essential worker, monitoring your kids, homeschooling your kids, worrying or taking care of other family members. So there's just a lot to do, and we need to set our priorities. And then what else they can do is very basically with the kids. Once you've got this under control, okay, now how do we deal with kids? Well, first, ask what they know. How did you learn about the coronavirus? What do you know about it? Where did you get your information? How do you feel about it? And the reason you need to ask these questions is because we can't help allay their anxieties and concerns without knowing what's going through their heads. So, for example, and validate their feelings, and you can correct misconceptions. So they may be worried about a grandparent who's in assisted living, and that may be a valid concern. And then you could basically say, well, grandma's getting the best care she possibly can, and we're doing everything to help. They may be worried about their dog getting COVID and dying. And then you could say, well, geez, that doesn't happen. So we can clarify them, but validate their feelings. I would say have ongoing conversations. This is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And check in with them from time to time so that they know that you're available. Structure is really important. So I would, whether you're doing a hybrid model or whether you're doing a remote model or in-school model, and all the in-school models generally have 1 or 2 days off, provide a structure. Kids, we all thrive on structure, but plan your every day of the week with wake-up times, with meals, with activities, with breaks, just as if it's in the schoolroom, because that is really a guiding thing. I would help them enjoy their own social supports. I think this is the time not to worry about screen time, except late at night. Blue screen keeps kids up, but they need to be in touch with each other, and this is a time to help facilitate that, and help them practice self-care, meditation, yoga, exercise, and they can do it with you. So they can learn those kinds of things with you. Another aspect, you focused, the Act and Discovery Museum focuses on creativity, and I noticed you have a speaker coming up on the arts. There's no better way for kids and adults to help alleviate anxiety than through self-expression.
Right.
So whether it's music, dance, playing my guitar, my new guitar I have in the back. Now, I'm taking guitar and piano lessons again. But I mean, journaling, writing are all helpful ways, and they've all been shown in research to help alleviate anxiety and depression and fears. So I would welcome us to kind of engage in the arts, and we can do that together, or we can do that separately.
Yeah. Are there ways if kids are sort of really negative, that we can help them sort of turn that around at all and turn negatives into positives at all?
Yeah, there are a few things. Oh, by the way, I didn't mention one other thing that I want to mention before I get into that, and that is for preschoolers and school-age kids, turn off the media. We are hostages to smartphones, tablets, computers, television sets, radio, and you can't turn anything on without getting blasted with bad news or difficult or news that makes us anxious. And especially for the younger kids, who don't really understand, these things, it's just too much. For the teenagers, I would watch the media that they're engaging in with them and making it part of the conversation. Now, to answer your question, how do we turn the negatives into the positives? There are a lot of ways of doing that. One way is having conversations about what we've taken for granted. I mean, how we used to be able to hug our relatives, and we can't do that now. Making contributions our brains are wired for giving rather than receiving. It's interesting. There's been a lot of studies about the release of oxytocin, for example, which is the chemical in the brain that kind of like brings us together. Like when you cuddle with your dog or you cuddle with your family member, you release oxytocin. Giving is much more of a reward and much more helpful than receiving. We like to get things, and so do kids, but contributing. There's another technique which I'll just explain really briefly. It's called cognitive behavior therapy. And just the real simple way, and it's really quite a simple and elegant model of turning negative thoughts into more catastrophic thoughts. So let me give you the example. So what we have as a trigger, and let's say the trigger is, fear that someone's going to get sick. And then you have a cognition, and the cognition is, mom and dad are going to die. Or let's say my life is ruined. And then you have an emotion, and the emotion is anxiety or depression. And then you have a behavior, which is withdrawal, irritability, anger, whatever. So trigger, cognition or thought, emotion, behavior. Now, what Aaron Beck, who was a professor of mine at Penn a long time ago, who invented this model and wrote the cognitive theory of depression, basically, our psychological models, these psychodynamic ones, typically felt that our emotions really are what the problem are. And if we can solve our emotional problems, then we can change the way we think and we behave. And what Aaron Beck discovered, and his followers as well, is that if we modify what our beliefs are, our thoughts are about the past, present, and future, we can reduce our emotions. So if you take that catastrophic thinking, like my life is ruined, and let's say you pretend that you can role play it, or you can have a devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other, or two attorneys depending on
Yeah.
what your predilection is, and have an argument. One saying like, my life is ruined. The other one says like, what do you mean it's ruined? Bad stuff's happened before. I mean, you've failed tests. You've lost pets. People have gotten sick. You've gotten through it. And no, it's done. It's done. Well, wait a second. How can that be? And then, we got through it. We had our family. We got through hurricanes. We got through, just last night, trees fell down, power's out. We lost the power. We light the candles. But it's gone. It's all gone. And the more you go back and forth, kind of debating yourself, what happens is your level of catastrophic thinking comes down to a more realistic version. You can't deny that this is a really difficult time. You can't deny the truth. But you can change it from a catastrophic or very severe and distorted and exaggerated view to something that's much more realistic. And once you're in that realistic frame, the emotions come down, the feelings come down, and then you can plan your behavior to cope and to accommodate and to help make things better. So cognitive behavior therapy is a really cool tool to have in your toolbox, and it can actually be fun. I mean, you can actually make it into a game. It can be play.
It sounds. Do you think that that's something that parents could feel comfortable, teaching their kids to do? I think.
Oh yeah, I mean, I would make it playful. I would, it doesn't matter how you do it. I mean, this is not, like, it doesn't have to be serious. You can role play this with your kids. You can role play it with your partner. You can role play it by yourself. And it's really very, very helpful, and it's easily taught. And there are online modules, and there's references at the Clay Center, say, where you can go and see people teaching cognitive behavior therapy. But it's not rocket science. It's really it's based on common sense and kind of a practical way of kind of bringing your thoughts, into more realistic frameworks, so that we can actually deal with them.
Yeah, those are really helpful thoughts for parents, Jean. That everybody is struggling so much to figure it all out. A number of our folks who are with us tonight are teachers, and their situation is even a little different. They've got kids who are maybe in their classroom or maybe online that they're talking to on a regular basis. They're probably trying to figure out, like, what are the biggest things that are stressing out their students, and then what can they do?
Well, I think the teachers also need to know when to worry, what to what to look for, when to worry, what to do, and they're going to be seeing kids stressed out. They're going to be seeing problems that are emotional, that are social, that are academic. And what's important and valuable from the teacher's standpoint is that even though they're not living with these kids and they may not be as expert in as the parents are in knowing their kids, they are good objective observers, and they can corroborate or they can question when they see a kid change. So they're key professionals to monitor social, academic, emotional, areas of a child's life. So they need to be prepared for seeing kids who are irritable, depressed, anxious, lonely, worried, and at the end of the line, they can refer them for counseling. But even before they can do that, I think teachers right now should spend more time on focusing on the emotional side of the child's or teenager's life. Because, frankly, will catch up in reading, writing, and arithmetic. You know, but we won't be able to even get to that if a child or teenager is struggling emotionally. And so I think social emotional learning is really important, checking in with them, asking how they're doing, finding a way to build self-care into the classroom. I mean, take a moment to meditate, take a moment to sing, take a moment to watch a silly video, take a moment to kind of like, you know, see how they're responding to the world around them. They can use cognitive behavioral techniques. They can use creative techniques such as essays, teaching them how to write a haiku, 17 syllables, but it says a lot, you know, and to have discussions that are more geared towards coping, what's going on in the world around them. And you know, the other thing is that this isn't just COVID for many kids. They're worried about lots of other things. I mean, they're worried about climate change. They're worried about wildfires. They're worried about tornadoes and derechos and hurricanes that are coming. They're worried about the drought, you know, which we've had right here in Acton. And they're thinking about it, from school-age kids through teenagers. They're also worried about social issues more than ever, not just climate change, but they're worried about racial, ethnic, gender disparities, economic disparities. They're worried about what's going on in the world. They're worried about police brutality. They're worried about I'll try very hard not to get political. They're worried about the lack of civility and the lack of ability to actually have reasonable conversations, even if people oppose each other in certain areas, which is fine. We always do that. There's all conflict. In your own family, there are conflicts. But can we talk about it? And can we deal with some of these issues? So this really is, I think, a perfect storm, and addressing some of those issues that the kids are worried about, that go beyond COVID, that actually amplify some of the concerns in COVID, are going to be incredibly important. And what better place than, you know, in school, whether it's virtual or whether it's, you know, face-to-face.
Jean, is there you know, just, is there any data yet on sort of the levels of stress and anxiety, you know, that are happening right now, as opposed to the sort of normal levels, if you will?
Well, there's bad news and there's bad news. I don't mean to be a downer about this, but prior to COVID, Gen Z and millennials were more depressed, anxious, stressed, and lonely than any other generation. And there's a lot of reasons for this that we can postulate. I don't think anybody knows exactly why, but we know that the suicide rates have been going up since 2014. And we know that that anxiety and stress are going up. The American Academy of Pediatrics just came out recently and published that 1 out of 3 kids has an anxiety disorder. That means anxiety that affects their social, emotional, academic, recreational functioning. So, and that's pre-COVID. So it's exacerbated by COVID. Now, with that being said, COVID amplifies it. But again, it also gives us an opportunity. You know, the way I say to my kids and grandchildren, you know, out of the ashes rises the phoenix. You know, when you think about the major changes we've made in society, and I don't want to get into a lecture with them, but, you know, think of, you know, things like Social Security, about Medicare, about women's rights, about civil rights, we have a long way to go, but they didn't come out of happy places. They came out of adversity, So what I say to my adult kids and my grandchildren is, look, some of the greatest changes that have happened have come out of really hard times. We're not complacent. We have to be proactive, and we have to think of what we can do, what we can contribute to make the world a better place. And it gives us an opportunity. So again, turning the negative into the positive and providing hope is, I think, essential. And not just whining and complaining and crying about it, which is probably going to happen, but thinking about, what could we do that's different? I mean, this is what happened out of Parkland and the hashtag Never Again. It's what teenage activism came before COVID, whether it was about climate change or about the hashtag Me Too movement, or about the, teenage activism is good for teenagers. And having active, civilized debates, even for those who don't agree with what your movement is, it makes us think more complexly. And I think the more we can think in a complex way, the more we can see the nuances, the more we can see the textures and the gradations from an early age, the better it is for emotional health and the better it is for society.
Yeah. I really like the advice, Jean, of more than just sort of coping with the situation, sort of confronting it and finding solutions and moving forward. It's a really, gives kids a sense of power if they, you help them figure out that they can do something, and that things have happened out of that. It's a really strong question. So I want to move on from the questions of sort of that were about kind of current levels of stress and anxiety to sort of longer term questions that some folks asked. One question that was asked was, will the remote learning that's going on that may last for an extended period of time cause sort of developmental issues with their kid? Is their kid going to fall behind?
Let me begin by saying the kids who are most likely to fall behind are the ones who are most vulnerable. Younger kids who thrive on in-person learning, developmentally challenged and neuroatypical kids, kids who need mental health monitoring, who have psychiatric disorders, kids who can't be homeschooled either because the parents are essential workers or don't know the academics or don't speak English, kids who have food insecurity, and like 16% of Boston doesn't have internet access. I mean, so those are the vulnerable groups. Fortunately, we're pretty well off out here in Acton. We don't have to face a lot of those things, although some of them I think are quite pertinent, particularly the ones about developmental disabilities and kids who need extra help. One of the things that's come up is will kids lose social emotional learning by not being present with each other? And that is an important domain. In some ways, like I said earlier, it's relatively easy to make up reading, writing, arithmetic, science. You can catch up, but social emotional learning is kind of an ongoing process. Now, all that being said, the great thing about being human is that what we miss in development is never lost. We can make it up. I mean, the brain has 100 billion neurons, each with 10,000 synaptic connections. That means little nerves that are attached to each. I've always been bad at math, but I can't even calculate how many connections that is. And it's always changing. It's always changing. Some people, the fact that some people will remember something I said tonight means that I've changed the structure of your brain, because it's there, and it's not going to be forgotten, or it will be remembered at some other point in time. That requires a structural change. It means one of those little, or a few of those little connections made some other connections. The good news about this is that, well, the cool thing about being human is that we can make up what we've missed in development. You could always go back and pick up the pieces, and catch up. And I would urge people not to bemoan the fact that their kids are going to fall behind and they're never going to recover. That's just nonsense. You know, I've taken care of people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s who are still coming to terms with things that they missed, you know, during adolescence. You know, and think about it this way too. I mean, you know, this is a unique situation for us, but what if you were living in Europe during World War I or during World War II? And you were really derailed. I mean, your cities were being bombed. You couldn't go to school, you know, or you were in orphanages because you lost your parents. I mean, many of those kids were traumatized, and indeed, trauma is one thing. But you know, my parents went through it. I don't think they were developmentally delayed. They missed out on some things, you know, during the Great Depression and World War II, but they caught up. And I think we should always remember that we can catch up. The key thing is to monitor what would be normative for a particular age of a kid. Do they have an issue with identity? Do they have an issue with self-esteem? Do they have an issue with knowing how to make friends? Do they have an issue with you know, regulating their emotions? Okay, if they do, then we can try to plan a way for them to recapture that later on. And it's always possible to capture that. So I would not worry about things being lost forever.
That's powerful advice. Hopefully that takes a little bit of pressure off of people out there, and sort of reduces a little bit of overall anxiety. Because I think, you know, it is something that people don't really, that notion of continuous growth in the brain is kind of an important part of that.
And Neil, I might add to that, you know, that we've learned is that kids do best when there's consistency. We all do best when there's consistency across environments. So if we think about, you know, where do kids live? They live at home, they live at school, they live in the community, and to have members of teachers and parents and spiritual and community leaders and coaches working together and collaborating around a particular child is going to be incredibly important. And frankly, I think that should be the norm. You know, we may not be doing enough of that during everyday life, but the more we do collaborate across different sectors in which our kids are living, the better adjusted they are, and the more you know, the more growth they can obtain.
Maybe we'll all learn a lot about what's important for our kids in this crisis, right? You touched earlier on you know, another topic that folks have raised, you know, in small ways and in big ways. You know, many people are experiencing, you know, loss and the grief that comes with that. You know, sort of what kind of advice do you have for people about loss and grief?
Well, you know, the ultimate loss is death, and sadly, some people watching know somebody that's either died or become impaired because of COVID. That's one form of loss. But there are other losses that I mentioned, loss of opportunities, loss of being with friends and family and connecting. And the reaction is typically anxiety, depression, stress, worry, and physical manifestations. So how do we deal with this? There are a number of things that can be done. First of all, stay connected. I mean, as I said, we're pack animals. Humans are pack animals. And we belong together. And that's why I say don't worry about screen time for connecting with people. I'm so impressed, for example, with how I can connect with my 3-year-old granddaughter, my 4-year-old grandson on the screen. I mean, they take to it like fish to water. I mean, it's just like we're there. So the screen can be helpful in staying connected. And there's also connections that we can, have outdoors. It's going to be with social distancing and with masks, but we can stay connected. Having frequent conversations. I've mentioned this before, but, dealing with loss, conversing. Also, kids love family stories, family narratives. Narratives, in fact, are some of the ways. I mean, every spiritual group in this forever has been built upon narratives. Our brains are wired for narratives. And whether it's a bedtime story or whether it's, a fairy tale or whether it's a story of when the tree fell on the house and we got through it, or when, the pipes broke and the house flooded, or when we lost power for a week, that one winter here in Acton where we had like 10 feet of snow and we were literally buried. I mean, we got through it. And I remember when my mom, who passed a couple of years ago at almost 102, would tell us stories about the Great Depression and about what it was like in New York City and how she got through really hard times. She was a pianist and she would play in department stores. she concert pianist. She would play in concerts. She would play, and she for a while she was a Powers model, because she was very attractive, and she would design their furs. She would do whatever it took. And when she would tell those stories, my kids and the whole family were just captivated. In fact, we even recorded hours of her telling narratives. We all have family narratives of getting through hard times and succeeding. And I think it's really valuable to do that. Another thing that I've heard from many parents is that, despite the fact that we're all isolated to a great extent, they've never had more dinners together. They've never had more time with each other. They've never, and so what do? You watch some movies together. You play games together. You do things together. And even if you're not in the same household, I remember when the quarantine began, my family began a quarantine Spotify playlist, and we all contributed songs. It didn't last that long, but it was a good start. So those are some of the things that we can do to cope with loss. And again, we can again turn the negative into the positive. I think making a contribution, I'm going to come back to that, because there's so much that we can give to other people, whether it's a smiley face or a video or a card of to the folks who are homeless from the wildfires, to some of the families whose family members have died of COVID or have been very sick, and also doing things with peers, creating montages, creating artistic endeavors, sharing videos with each other. That kind of interpersonal collaboration and contributing to somebody else's life Um, here's a good book that you could read, or here's some sharing poems. My medical students are doing that with each other to get through this. It's remarkable. So it helps kids and people of all ages to feel like they made a contribution. Just think about what happened after 9/11. I mean, so many kids wanted to contribute. So many kids drew pictures to help the kids who had lost friends, relatives, parents, and it made a huge, huge difference.
Yeah. Those all great advice. The other thing that people were asking about, in addition to grief and loss, is sort of, and you mentioned this a little bit before about loneliness among kids and adults, I guess. Sort of what are really the consequences of that, and how do people cope with loneliness?
Well, what's striking, and this again is pre-COVID. The BBC did a large-scale study of 16 to 24-year-olds and found out that that 40% were lonely compared to 27% of the elderly. We think of old folks like me as being lonely. The Gen Z and millennials are lonelier than any generations on record. Cigna did a very large study of loneliness. Now, the reasons for why kids are lonely, we can get into, but loneliness has a big impact on people. It has emotional aspects such as depression, thoughts of suicide, poor sleep, lack of concentration. It fosters difficulty with self-regulation. So when people are lonely, what do? They overeat, they drink too much. I'm thinking of adults now, of course. Smoke, substances to help themselves feel better. Now, those are not functional ways of coping with loneliness, but it happens. And loneliness has been shown to weaken the immune system, so it does have physical manifestations. So it has a big impact. And again, what do? Well, we can give to others. We can join a group. There are many online groups right now. One of the rages that's happening right now is Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, I can't tell you how many young people and young adults have have gotten back into it. And remember when that old game Myst, which was one of those.
Oh yeah.
It's like Myst. It's like putting together a puzzle, trying to figure something out with other people. So joining groups that do different things. If you have a pet, it's quite hard to get pets right now. I'm on a waiting list now for a year to get my dog. My dog died in July. Pets are great companions. Self-care. Trying to understand why you're lonely. What is it? Is it because you're using too much social media and there's fear of missing out on things, or you're lonely because you can't do some of the things that you did with your friends? But you can think of other creative ways of combating that. You can still take walks in the woods with social distancing. You can still go on a bike ride with friends. You can still hang out in other ways. And joining a community with a mission, whether it's a political mission or a social mission or an environmental mission, is also an incredible way to combat loneliness.
That's great. So I've gotten a couple of questions via the Q&A. So I'm going to start reading you a couple of these, Jean. We'll see how we do. So this whole notion, and there were some questions ahead of time about this as well. The kids who are going to keep experiencing these transitions in school now. So kids going from remote schooling, where they're home by themselves, to a hybrid one, where they're back in the classroom. That's going to happen. The person here mentions both a middle schooler and a third grader, if you think there are differences between the ages. Sort of thinking about that transition to a different learning environment, and maybe where that's been potentially hyped up as more dangerous.
I think we underestimate how flexible kids can be. I think as long as the parents can provide a structure, what I would suggest everybody do is have backup plans. What if we go completely remote and we're locked down again because we have a second wave that's coming about when the flu season hits? What would we do? How would we maintain a hybrid model? And providing a structure at home that can, if possible, that can accommodate a variety of backup plans. This is not the time, in my view, to fly by the seat of your pants and just improvise. As much as I love improvising, we can improvise within a structure. It is different for third graders than it is for middle schoolers. Middle schoolers are under, I think the two groups that are under huge stress right now are kids who are rising from middle school to high school, which is a very scary time and a very difficult time because the work is getting harder, the demands are harder, there are big kids all around them. They don't know if they can keep up. There's so many things that now it really counts, and the pressure's on. And seniors who are ready to launch, those are very stressful times. But again, even for both of those groups, as well as for third graders, if you have a plan, if you kind of talk about the plan or the various plans ahead of time so that they're ready for it, in many ways, kids are more flexible than adults are. And I think it's incumbent upon us as adults to embrace change and be as flexible and creative and as possible, and demonstrate to our kids that we can adapt. And that's what it's all about. It's about adaptation.
Yeah, everybody's learned a lot more about flexibility in these times. That's for sure. Flexibility and boredom, I think, are the two things I've learned a lot about. A person raises the question about sort of the challenges of navigating different people and different families having sort of different beliefs about the crisis. Specifically, how do you speak to your tween or teen child when their family has been really prioritizing social distancing and mask guidelines, and then they see their neighbors sort of being close with each other, not wearing masks, and then they hear from their friends that, no, this isn't really a very serious situation. How do you help your kid get through that?
It's tough. I think I'll probably expose myself politically here, but we've got to follow science, just as the Discovery Museum follows science. We have to say that in a civilized way, we have to basically say, look, we know this is a very contagious illness. We know that it can have serious implications for young and old. And the best scientists in the world have shown that wearing a mask, washing hands, keeping socially distant is the most effective way of quelling this virus until, if we are able to have a vaccine and have better treatments for it. If you have to say this without necessarily condemning other people. If they want to take their life in their hands, that's their business. What I would say to kids is, look, Um, it's hard to say this without being condemning, but the reason we wear seatbelts and the reason we get stopped and get a ticket if we drive and a police officer sees us drinking a bottle of vodka is because we're endangering others. It's our social obligation to keep each other safe. The people out there who are not wearing masks, who don't believe that this is a dangerous illness, who are endangering society, are basically driving drunk, and that's not a safe thing to do. We don't believe in that. If you ever did that, you'd lose the car for a long time. If I ever caught you doing that. But I mean, I do think that parents have a role in taking a moral, ethical, scientific stance. Just as we would argue that if a kid asks us, is there racism in this country? Is there economic and gender disparities in this country? Are the LGBTQ communities in this country under more pressure? The answer is clear to me, yes. Now, lots of people have beliefs about this, but I think part of our job as parents is to teach our kids what we think is right. If you're of the belief that science doesn't matter, those parents will tell their kids those things. But I think my hope is that, and the vast majority of people in the country believe that science should be followed and that we have a social obligation to take care of each other. So it's hard to do without devaluing those other people. But, you know, I think another way they can do it is they could say, do you have an idea why they think that? Have a conversation about it. You know, I'm old enough to remember when William F. Buckley was debating Gore Vidal. That's a long time ago. But there were, I thought, I didn't believe anything, I shouldn't say anything, but George F. Buckley was not my, favorite guy. And Gore Vidal had his problems too, but we could have conversations about different points of view and explain our reasons for it. And I think kids need to understand how we're thinking, why we're thinking, what our conclusions are, and also let them argue with us. It's arguments are great. Make your conversations little debates.
Yeah, you're right, Gene. In some ways, that example and the example of the masking and the social distancing is just a microcosm of what kids are going to face lots of times in their lives. It becomes a teachable moment, I think, right?
Right. It does. I think it does become a teachable moment, and I think we have to help our kids to think through their positions and be able to discuss their positions with other kids who may have different points of view. Yeah. It's going to come up over and over again, and it's kind of the nature of being human. We're going to have different opinions about the economy, about tackling climate change, about fixing the healthcare system, about creating new jobs, when the world becomes more robotic, and the standard jobs on the manufacturing line don't exist anymore. I want kids to be thinking about, okay, how are we going to do this so that everybody can have a place? And we will all differ, perhaps, in how it gets accomplished. But, I think the other thing is find common ground. It's so interesting. That's another thing that can help. everybody wants a peaceful society, hopefully. Everybody wants to be respected. Everybody wants their voice to be heard. Everybody wants to have positive self-esteem. Everybody wants to have an intact family. Of course, there are outliers, but everybody wants to have good health care. Everybody wants to be able to make a good living and support a family. The devil's in the details and in the philosophy of how we get to those common goals. So I think that's another way of doing it, is to show that we all have the common goals of freedom, liberty, equality under the law, and how we're going to get there.
Yeah, the question on this had a tricky follow-up piece to it that is scary to answer, which is, so what happens when in that situation where your kid loses a friend over that kind of issue?
It happens all the time, especially on college campuses. I can tell you, I know a number of kids that I see who come from very conservative backgrounds, politically conservative backgrounds, and they are summarily. Look, I'll be honest. I'm liberal, and have always been on that side of the fence. But what I don't like is when I see kids on college campuses who come from conservative backgrounds who are summarily dismissed by mainstream, liberal kids. Let them have a voice. Let them voice their opinion. Let them explain themselves. Show them some respect. Even if you disagree, we can agree to disagree. So, one of the things, this gets to the educators too. I don't think we've ever had a good K through college conflict resolution curriculum. They do exist around the country, but wouldn't it be nice if we could have as an ongoing mandate social emotional learning, and one component of that is how to resolve conflicts, in a fair, even-handed way, and if not resolve the conflicts, at least accept differences of opinion.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's like just a critical skill set for our kids for the future is, working in groups, resolving conflicts, solving problems across boundaries. It's in the future skill set.
Well, social emotional learning really needs to come into its own. I think, frankly, the reason why a lot of adults lose their jobs is not because they don't have the knowledge, skills, or attitudes. The knowledge or skills, I should say. It's because of interpersonal conflict and the social emotional aspects of the workplace. And I think that there are plenty of wonderful curricula on social emotional learning. And I frankly think that as a life skill, it's as important, if not more important, than our core curriculum, for which the MCAS and other standardized tests are geared towards. They're not geared towards social emotional reasoning, but that's what gets us in trouble in life.
Not to digress on that topic too much, Jean, but it is one of the things that we hear a lot from kindergarten and first grade teachers, that their challenge with students showing up for school is not their academic preparedness, but their social and emotional preparedness. Right. So, couldn't agree with you more. So maybe one last question here. Somebody writes that you talked a little bit about not limiting screens for purposes of connecting with others, but this person writes that their son connects with his friends, but the context is gathering to play online video games together. Should we be worrying about this?
No. Look, yes, if they're, look, so there's a big controversy, and there's a blog actually that I wrote at the Clay Center site about gaming disorder. the World Health Organization believes that internet gaming disorder is a bona fide diagnosis, like an addiction. I won't go through the criteria. The American Psychiatric Association said it's worthy of more study. It probably occurs to the extent that it excludes other activities, it causes lying, it keeps kids up late at night, it impairs their functioning, it's about 3% of game players. Now, 3% may sound small, but autism was 1%. It's increasing. 3% is significant. If your kid has, problems with making excuses, choosing video games over other activities, failing academically, failing socially, choosing to do those video games, it's time to be concerned, and it is a problem. But I know a number of straight A students who play online video games and get their academic, social, sports, and other activities done. And if that's the case, you wouldn't say if a kid was playing the piano 6 or 8 hours a day, you wouldn't say it's a problem. If a kid were playing the violin or the cello or drawing 4 or 5, 6 hours a day, and they were getting their other stuff done, you wouldn't say it's a problem. One myth is that violent video games cause violent behavior. It's just not true. The data is very, very clear that if the kid can tell the difference between reality and fantasy, and a kid is playing violent video games, the kids that actually do act out violently are the ones that actually have what we call trait aggression to begin with. And I, with my colleagues at Mass General, did some studies on this. And it was a very small percent of boys who had trait aggression and girls who had trait depression that got into trouble by playing excessive video games. And there was a clear correlation between the amount those kids played and the amount of aggression. But to say that violent video games cause violent behavior is wrong. To say it's correlated with violent behavior is wrong too, except for a small percentage of kids. And I think that too much of anything is not really good for you. But it's funny when Little Caesar, the Jimmy Cagney movie, came out. There was a motion before Congress to censor it because they were afraid it was going to cause mobsters. In the movie Bye Bye Birdie, when the telephone scene at the very beginning was on, and everybody was worried about the horrors of the telephone, my mother used to say when she turned on the radio, because my grandfather got a radio back in the 30s, and she turned it on, and he said, "Don't listen to that damn classical music on the radio. Go to Carnegie Hall." Okay, so any new technology is going to have its worries and is going to have its risks. And I think you should put it in the context of how much they're playing, how much they're disregarding other things. Are they getting their other normative tasks in life done okay? I would not worry about it. And it may in fact be a way that kids can connect in a playful way, particularly during this period. But that's not to say that for some kids, a small percent, it can be a serious problem. And if it is, there are experts in gaming disorders, internet gaming disorders that are out there that can help.
That's great. I think that's sort of very sort of practical advice, Jean. Thanks for doing that. Thank you for the whole evening. Once again, I think we covered a wide swath of topics, and we were able to get through lots and lots of questions that people had out there, and we really appreciate you taking the time to share what you've learned over all these years, and And importantly, I would encourage everybody to go to mghclaycenter.org and follow up on some of the resources that Jean has talked about here tonight.
And let us know if there's stuff that you want covered by the Clay Center, because we really appreciate the feedback, and want to. I mean, our major mission is prevention and early intervention. We want to promote positive mental health, and if there are aspects of your lives that we're not addressing, let us know, because we will take care of it.
That's great. That's terrific. Well, I would encourage everybody to check out the future speaker series events and register for those. And we hope to see everybody again soon. Jean, take care. It's always good to see you.
Nice to see you too.
Take care, everybody. Good night.
Good night.